Welcome back to the Story Vault, Buried Truths. Or, if you're new here, welcome to the place where the past isn't polished, it's uncovered. Inside this vault, we dig through forgotten archives, strange moments, hidden scandals, and the stories history tried to fold away. Some are fascinating, some are unsettling, and some are so strange they sound like fiction, but they're not. So settle in, keep your curiosity close, and let the door close behind you. Because once the vault opens, the truth rarely stays buried for long. There was a time when a single garment could unsettle an empire. Not with weapons, not with politics, but with silk. In the middle of the 19th century, the Western world was tightly laced. Europe was structured socially, politically, physically. Women's bodies were shaped by corsets reinforced with whalebone and steel. Dresses expanded outward with crinolines, engineered cages that turned the human form into architecture. Clothing did not merely cover the body, it controlled it. Formality ruled, symmetry ruled, constraint ruled. And then, from across the sea, came something that did not obey those rules. It did not cinch, it did not sculpt, it did not demand. It flowed. The kimono entered Western consciousness not as a whisper, but as a shock. When Japan ended more than 2 centuries of relative isolation under the Tokugawa shogunate and opened select ports for foreign trade in the 1850s, the exchange that followed was not merely commercial, it was cultural. Ships carried tea, porcelain, lacquerware, woodblock prints, and textiles of extraordinary refinement. Silk dyed with gradients so subtle they seemed painted by air. Motifs drawn from nature, cranes, waves, maple leaves, arranged with deliberate asymmetry. Garments constructed from straight seams, designed to be taken apart and remade season after season. To Western eyes, this was not just clothing, it was philosophy in fabric. But a crush has a way of turning quickly into obsession. Europe, especially Paris and London, developed what can only be described as a crush, a fixation, a romantic infatuation with an imagined Japan. Collectors scrambled for Japanese goods. Artists rearranged their studios around imported screens and fans. Fashion houses studied the sleeves, the drape, the silhouette. The kimono seemed to promise freedom in an era of restriction. Freedom from corsetry, freedom from rigid tailoring, freedom from the idea that beauty required suffering. But the crush was not entirely innocent, because what the West fell in love with was not Japan as it was, but Japan as it wished it to be. Exotic, mysterious, timeless, untouched by modernity. Yet in Japan, the kimono was neither costume nor fantasy. It was daily life. It marked social rank. It reflected the seasons. It obeyed etiquette older than many European monarchies. It carried the weight of craft traditions passed down through generations of dyers, weavers, and embroiderers. To misunderstand it was easy. To truly understand it required context, and context does not always survive ocean crossings. This is the story of that crush, a story of admiration and distortion, of artistic revolution and cultural projection, of how a garment shaped in one island nation altered the aesthetic direction of an entire continent. We will move from Edo to Paris, from silk workshops to impressionist studios, from high society drawing rooms to haute couture runways, from fascination to controversy. Because the kimono did not simply influence fashion, it reshaped how the West imagined the East, and in doing so, it revealed something deeply human, our tendency to fall in love with what we only partially understand. So tonight, we unfold more than fabric. We unfold history. If you love stories where beauty hides tension, where art and politics intertwine, and where obsession leaves fingerprints across centuries, make sure you like and subscribe to the Story Vault, Buried Truths. Here, we don't just admire the surface, we trace the stitching underneath. Now, let's step into a world of silk and steel and begin. Chapter 1. A Nation Closed. Before silk ever crossed an ocean, before Paris fell in love with a silhouette it barely understood, Japan made a choice. It chose stillness. In 1603, power consolidated under the Tokugawa shogunate, beginning what historians call the Edo period. After more than a century of civil war, fractured alliances, shifting loyalties, castles rising and burning, the country settled into something rare in early modern history: prolonged peace. Peace, however, came with control. By the 1630s, the Tokugawa government enacted a series of edicts that would define Japan's relationship with the outside world for more than 2 centuries. The policy, later known as sakoku, often translated as closed country, was not a slammed door, but a carefully guarded gate. Foreign missionaries were expelled. Christianity, viewed as destabilizing and politically dangerous, was banned. Japanese subjects were forbidden to travel abroad. Those who left were not permitted to return. Large ocean-going ships were dismantled. Trade was reduced to a trickle and confined to specific ports, most notably Nagasaki, where Dutch and Chinese merchants operated under strict supervision. This was not ignorance. It was intentional insulation. While Europe entered the age of colonial expansion, while empires raced across oceans, planting flags and extracting wealth, Japan turned inward. And inside that inward turn, something intricate began to flourish. Edo, the city that would become Tokyo, grew into one of the largest urban centers in the world by the 18th century. Samurai bureaucrats governed. Merchants accumulated wealth. Artisans refined their craft. Literacy rates rose to levels that surprised later Western observers. Woodblock prints, ukiyo-e, circulated images of actors, courtesans, landscapes. Theater thrived. Poetry gatherings filled evenings with wit and seasonal awareness. Isolation did not mean stagnation. It meant self-definition. And within this structured society, clothing became language. The garment we now call the kimono did not arrive fully formed. It evolved gradually from earlier court dress influenced by Chinese styles during the Heian period. Over centuries, the kosode, literally small sleeve, became the foundation. By the Edo period, it had transformed into the recognizable T-shaped robe constructed from straight seams and narrow bolts of fabric. Its genius was structural simplicity. A kimono is cut from a single bolt of cloth called a tanmono, typically about 36 centimeters wide. The fabric is not sculpted to the curves of the body. It is not shaped through darts or tailoring. Instead, it wraps, folds, layers. It creates silhouette through arrangement, not alteration. Nothing is wasted. The garment can be taken apart for cleaning, re-dyed, passed down, remade for another family member. Fabric carries memory. In a society that valued continuity and hierarchy, this mattered. The kimono was not costume, it was daily architecture. Samurai wore subdued colors, indigo, brown, muted gray, often reserving elaborate decoration for the lining hidden from public view. A flash of brilliance inside a restrained exterior signaled discipline. Merchant classes, restricted by sumptuary laws that prohibited overt displays of wealth, mastered subtlety. From a distance, a garment might appear simple. Up close, the silk might shimmer with woven patterns only visible in certain light. Luxury learned to whisper. In the licensed pleasure quarters, most famously Yoshiwara in Edo, courtesans wore dazzling layered kimono with elongated sleeves and ornate obi. These garments were theatrical. Spectacle was part of the profession. Ukiyo-e artists immortalized these women in prints that circulated far beyond the district, shaping ideals of beauty. Every sleeve length meant something. Every motif meant something. Season governed everything. Plum blossoms in early spring, maple leaves in autumn, cranes for longevity, waves for resilience. To wear a pattern out of season was not merely unfashionable, it was insensitive to nature's rhythm. Because Edo society was not only hierarchical, it was seasonal, and the kimono reflected an aesthetic philosophy deeply embedded in Japanese culture, mono no aware, an awareness of impermanence, beauty heightened by its fleeting nature. Cherry blossoms bloom, cherry blossoms fall. Silk threads capture that moment. The way a kimono moves, the way it opens slightly at the collar, revealing the nape of the neck, was understood as quietly sensual. But sensuality in Edo, Japan, did not operate under the same moral codes as Victorian Europe. Erotic art existed openly in the form of shunga prints. The body was neither hidden in steel cages nor presented through rigid sculpting. The kimono did not force the body into shape. It framed it. This distinction would matter later when Western observers encountered it. But for now, Japan remained contained within its own orbit. The Tokugawa system enforced class divisions: samurai, peasants, artisans, merchants. Movement between classes was rare. Clothing reinforced status. Certain fabrics were restricted. Certain colors were reserved. Family crests, mon, identified lineage. 5 crests on a formal kimono signified high ceremony. Even the direction of wrapping carried meaning. The left side always crosses over the right for the living. The reverse, right over left, is reserved for the dead during burial preparation. The garment encoded life and death. Precision mattered. And yet, within that precision, creativity thrived. Dyeing techniques such as yuzen allowed artisans to paint directly onto silk, creating landscapes across fabric. Shibori tie-dye produced intricate resist patterns. Gold leaf and embroidery elevated garments to works of art. Workshops guarded techniques. Families passed skills down through generations. A kimono was rarely the work of one pair of hands. Weaver, dyer, embroiderer, seamstress, each contributed to the final whole. This was not fast fashion. This was collaborative craft. Meanwhile, Europe was expanding aggressively outward. The 17th and 18th centuries saw colonial ventures reshape continents. Commodities flowed, sugar, tobacco, cotton, silk. But Japan remained outside that web, largely by force of policy. Foreign knowledge entered selectively through rangaku, Dutch learning, scientific texts, anatomical drawings, astronomical instruments filtered through Nagasaki. Japan observed the world cautiously. It learned, it adapted, but it did not surrender autonomy easily. By the early 19th century, pressure mounted. Western powers, armed with steamships and artillery, sought trade routes and coaling stations. The Pacific was becoming strategically significant. American whaling ships roamed its waters. Diplomatic patience thinned. In 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay with 4 black-hulled steamships. Their arrival was not subtle. Cannons faced shore, smoke billowed. The display of industrial power was deliberate. Isolation had protected Japan for over 2 centuries. Now, steel demanded entry. The following year, under mounting pressure, Japan signed the Convention of Kanagawa, opening limited ports to American vessels. Other Western powers soon negotiated similar treaties. The age of seclusion ended not with quiet consensus, but with geopolitical inevitability. The gate did not shatter, but it opened. And when it did, what flowed outward was not only tea and porcelain, it was silk. The kimono, shaped by centuries of internal development, carried with it layers of meaning Western observers would struggle to read. To European eyes, accustomed to tailored seams and corseted waists, the kimono's straight construction appeared radical. Its looseness felt liberating. Its asymmetry felt modern, even though it was centuries old. But what they saw was surface. They did not immediately see the social code stitched into every fold. They did not see the seasonal discipline. They did not see the way class and identity were woven invisibly into thread. They saw beauty. They saw difference. And difference, when encountered suddenly, can feel intoxicating. Before the crush, there was containment. Before obsession, there was quiet evolution. The kimono did not emerge from exotic mystery. It emerged from stability, from regulation, from a society that believed harmony could be engineered through order. And as the 19th century advanced, Japan would change rapidly. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 would dismantle the shogunate, accelerate industrialization, and encourage Western dress for officials and military officers. The kimono would gradually shift from everyday necessity to cultural symbol. But that transformation belongs to the next chapter. For now, imagine Edo at dusk. Paper lanterns glowing softly. Wooden sandals tapping along stone paths. Sleeves brushing air as people pass one another in quiet choreography. A nation contained. A garment refined in stillness. Unaware that soon, across an ocean, an entire continent would fall in love with its silhouette and misunderstand its soul. And that is where the crush begins. Chapter 2. The West Discovers Japan. When the gates opened, the world did not rush in quietly. It leaned forward. In 1854, after the signing of the Convention of Kanagawa, Japan stepped into an uneasy new era of diplomacy and trade. What had been carefully contained for more than 2 centuries began to move outward, slowly at first, then with growing velocity. Ships left Japanese ports carrying lacquerware that gleamed like polished night, porcelain thin as breath, folding screens painted with gold leaf landscapes, woodblock prints alive with actors, courtesans, and sudden rainstorms, and silk. Bolts of silk dyed in gradients so soft they seemed to dissolve at the edges, robes constructed with a geometry that defied Western tailoring, sleeves that hung like wings. Europe had never seen anything quite like it. The mid-19th century was already an age of spectacle. International exhibitions, world's fairs, had become theaters of empire where nations displayed their industrial power and colonial acquisitions beneath iron and glass structures. In 1851, London hosted the Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace, a cathedral of modernity that showcased machinery, textiles, and technological triumph. But when Japan made a formal appearance at the 1867 Exposition Universelle in Paris, the effect was different. It was not industrial might that stunned the crowd. It was aesthetic restraint. Visitors walked through displays of ceramics, bronzes, woodblock prints, ukiyo-e, and textiles that seemed to obey a completely different visual logic. Patterns did not crowd the eye. Negative space was intentional. Asymmetry felt balanced. Nature appeared not as decoration, but philosophy. And then there were the garments. Kimonos hung like paintings that could move. To a European audience accustomed to bodices shaped by corsetry and skirts engineered with crinoline cages, the kimono's construction felt almost radical. It did not carve the body into fashionable proportions. It wrapped it. It suggested rather than sculpted. It felt modern, though in truth it was centuries old. Paris, already the epicenter of fashion and artistic experimentation, reacted first and most intensely. Critics and collectors scrambled to acquire Japanese goods. Shops began importing fans, parasols, screens. The aesthetic filtered into drawing rooms and studios, and soon a word emerged to describe the phenomenon: Japonisme. The term did not simply describe appreciation, it described influence, absorption, a creative intoxication with Japanese art and design. Painters were among the first to fall under its spell. When Japanese woodblock prints began circulating in Europe, sometimes used as packing material for exported ceramics, artists studied them obsessively. The flattened perspective, the bold outlines, the unconventional cropping, scenes that cut off figures at the edge of the frame, as if life continued beyond the canvas. These prints disrupted Western conventions of depth and composition. They suggested that realism did not require illusionistic perspective. They suggested that beauty could exist in pattern and plane. Artists like Claude Monet began collecting Japanese prints in large numbers. Monet would eventually own over 200. Edgar Degas studied their framing techniques. Mary Cassatt absorbed their influence into her intimate domestic scenes. But perhaps no painting captures the fever of the moment more clearly than La Japonaise. In 1876, Monet painted his wife Camille dressed in a bright red kimono, standing before a wall covered in Japanese fans. The robe is extravagant, theatrical, more costume than daily wear. Camille holds a fan and looks outward with playful defiance. The painting was not an ethnographic study. It was fantasy. It reflected not Japan as it was, but Japan as imagined through Parisian desire. The kimono in this context became a symbol of aesthetic liberation. Europe in the 1860s and 70s was grappling with modernity. Industrialization reshaped cities. Smokestacks pierced skylines. Railways collapsed distance. Traditional hierarchies strained under economic and political change. Amid this upheaval, Japanese design appeared serene, ordered, timeless. The kimono's straight seams and modular construction fascinated designers accustomed to cutting and shaping fabric to fit the body. Here was a garment made from rectangles, a garment that wasted nothing, a garment that could be taken apart and remade. Its logic felt almost architectural. And in an era obsessed with novelty, Japan offered something that felt both ancient and startlingly new. But fascination is rarely neutral. Europe did not merely observe Japan, it filtered it. The 19th century was also the age of Orientalism, a Western framework that exoticized Eastern cultures, portraying them as sensual, mysterious, and fundamentally different from the rational, industrial West. Painters depicted imagined harems, writers romanticized distant lands. Difference became spectacle. Japan, newly accessible, entered that imaginative geography. The kimono became shorthand for the East. It appeared in operas and stage productions. In 1885, the London premiere of The Mikado by W.S. Gilbert and Arthur Sullivan presented a comic vision of Japan that was less documentary than decorative. Costumes borrowed visual cues without full cultural context. Audiences were delighted. Accuracy was secondary. Meanwhile, collectors amassed Japanese goods not only for aesthetic appreciation, but for status. Owning imported artifacts signaled sophistication. Studios filled with screens and ceramics became backdrops for artistic identity. Even interior design shifted. Rooms once dominated by heavy Victorian ornamentation began incorporating lighter palettes and asymmetrical arrangements inspired by Japanese minimalism. The kimono entered private space. In Britain and France, imported kimonos were worn as dressing gowns, informal garments for the home. They were often draped loosely over corseted bodies, tied casually, stripped of their structured etiquette. The obi, the wide sash that secures the kimono, was frequently replaced with simpler belts. Sleeves trailed along polished floors. The garment became intimate. And yet, it was rarely worn correctly. In Japan, the left panel crosses over the right. The collar placement carries significance. Sleeve length signals age and marital status. Fabric weight corresponds to season. The way one walks in a kimono, smaller steps, controlled movement, is part of the ensemble. These details were often lost in translation. What the West embraced was silhouette and surface, not system. But cultural exchange is rarely one-directional. As Europe absorbed Japanese aesthetics, Japan observed Europe with increasing urgency. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate and restored imperial rule under Emperor Meiji. The new government embarked on rapid modernization, adopting Western military structures, educational systems, and dress for officials. In photographs from the 1870s, Japanese statesmen appear in tailored suits and military uniforms modeled after European examples. Western dress became associated with progress. The kimono, once everyday wear, began its slow transition towards ceremonial garment.
So while Paris romanticized silk sleeves, Tokyo experimented with waistcoats. This mutual gaze complicated the narrative. The West's discovery of Japan was not simply a story of admiration, it was entangled with power. Unequal treaties imposed tariffs that favored Western interests. Foreign settlements operated under extraterritorial rights. Economic and political pressure shaped the terms of exchange. The crush existed within asymmetry. And yet, art flourished in the space between misunderstanding and inspiration. The flat plains of ukiyo-e influenced the rise of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. Designers began questioning rigid corsetry. By the early 20th century, figures like Paul Poiret would explicitly draw on kimono construction to create looser silhouettes that redefined women's fashion. But in the 1860s and 1870s, it was still new, still electric. Imagine walking through Paris in 1870. Gas lamps flicker. Carriages rattle over cobblestone. In a studio near Montmartre, an artist pins a Japanese print to the wall. He studies the curve of a wave, the placement of a crane against empty sky. Across town, a fashionable woman slips into a silk robe imported from Yokohama. She admires the drape in a mirror framed with gilt. Neither fully understands the garment's lineage. Both feel its allure. The West had discovered Japan, or at least it believed it had. What it truly discovered was a mirror, one that reflected its own longing for beauty unburdened by industrial severity. The kimono, carried across oceans, became emblem and metaphor. A garment born in controlled isolation now ignited imagination in cities defined by expansion. And the crush deepened. Because once you fall in love with a silhouette, you begin trying to make it your own. And that is where admiration begins to blur into transformation. Chapter 3. Dressing the Fantasy. Infatuation rarely begins with understanding. It begins with feeling. By the 1870s, the West was no longer simply discovering Japan. It was incorporating it. Not cautiously, not academically, but emotionally. Silk sleeves slipped into private rooms. Folding screens divided Victorian parlors. Japanese fans adorned walls not as tools, but as trophies of taste. What had once been distant became decorative, and decoration in the 19th century was never neutral. In Britain and France, imported kimonos began to circulate as objects of domestic luxury. They were worn not as formal attire, not as daily clothing in the structured way they functioned in Japan, but as informal garments, tea robes, dressing gowns, artistic loungewear. They entered the space between public and private, between performance and intimacy. For women bound by corsets and social codes, this mattered. Victorian fashion was architecture, bodices reinforced with boning, skirts supported by cages, layers upon layers creating silhouette through compression and expansion. Clothing structured the body according to moral and aesthetic expectations. The ideal form was not natural, it was engineered. The kimono disrupted that engineering. Its straight seams refused to carve the torso into an hourglass. Its wide sleeves resisted restriction. Its fabric moved when the body moved, rather than forcing the body into shape. To wear one, even incorrectly, felt like stepping outside the rules. The aesthetic movement in Britain embraced this sensation wholeheartedly. Artists and writers rejected industrial ugliness and mass production in favor of beauty for its own sake. They turned to medievalism, to classical forms, and increasingly to Japan. Figures like Oscar Wilde championed loose, flowing garments as markers of refined taste. Wilde himself lectured on interior decoration, praising Japanese simplicity and balance. In artistic circles, to drape oneself in a kimono-inspired robe signaled not ignorance, but sophistication. At least, that was the intention. In reality, what emerged was something more complex. The kimono in Japan was never a shapeless garment. It was structured through ritual. The left panel crossed over the right, always. The obi was tied with precision, its knot placement varying depending on gender, age, and occasion. Sleeve length signaled marital status. Fabric weight reflected season. Movement was deliberate, smaller steps, controlled gestures, posture adjusted to maintain elegance. In London drawing rooms, these systems dissolved. Imported kimonos were often worn open at the front, tied loosely with sashes that bore little resemblance to traditional obi. They were layered over corsets rather than replacing them. Sleeves trailed dramatically. The garment became less a disciplined ensemble and more a romantic prop. It was Japan, edited. The fantasy deepened through art. Painters began depicting women in kimono within Western interiors, reclining, reading, gazing outward in contemplation. These images suggested sensuality, but softened by domesticity. The kimono framed the body differently than European dress. The nape of the neck, subtly revealed, became focal point. In Japan, the back of the neck had long been considered an erogenous zone, a flash of skin between collar and hairline, signaling intimacy. Western artists, consciously or not, absorbed this detail. The kimono's cut invited a new visual emphasis. Yet context remained partial. The 19th century was also the height of Orientalism, a term later defined and critiqued by scholar Edward Said to describe how the West constructed romanticized, often distorted images of Eastern cultures. These images were less about accurate representation and more about reinforcing Western identity. Japan became part of that imaginative geography. It was portrayed as delicate, refined, feminine, in contrast to Europe's industrial masculinity. The kimono, with its flowing lines, reinforced that perception. But Japan was not passive. During the Meiji period, the government actively modernized, adopting Western military uniforms, tailoring techniques, and industrial practices. Photographs from the 1870s and 1880s show Japanese officials in tailored suits, their hair cut short in Western style. While Europe draped itself in silk fantasy, Japan donned woolen pragmatism. This parallel transformation complicates the narrative of simple appropriation. Cultural exchange was happening in both directions, but under unequal global power dynamics. Still, within Western domestic spaces, the kimono took on a particular emotional charge. It became associated with artistic women, those who resisted rigid Victorian norms. In certain circles, abandoning the corset was seen as an act of rebellion. Reform dress movements advocated looser garments for health and comfort. Though these movements did not adopt the kimono wholesale, its presence reinforced the idea that clothing could be reimagined. Imagine a candlelit studio in 1880s London. An easel stands near a window. Japanese prints line the wall. A woman stands before a mirror, slipping into a silk robe. For a moment, she feels untethered from social expectation. The crush was not only aesthetic, it was psychological. The kimono symbolized an elsewhere, a world imagined as harmonious, balanced, untouched by industrial soot. Whether that image was accurate mattered less than what it represented, and representation has power. By the late 19th century, kimono-inspired garments were being produced domestically in Europe. Manufacturers mimicked sleeve shapes, incorporated Japanese motifs into printed textiles, and marketed Oriental robes to consumers eager for novelty. Commercialization accelerated fantasy. Patterns once tied to specific seasons or symbolic meanings were reproduced without context. Cranes and chrysanthemums appeared on mass-produced fabrics. What had been carefully regulated by sumptuary laws in Edo, Japan, became decorative abundance in Parisian boutiques. The crush matured into consumption. Opera and theater amplified the image. Productions set in exotic Japan featured stylized costumes that blended accuracy with invention. Audiences expected spectacle, and spectacle was delivered. Silk shimmered beneath stage lights, hairstyles exaggerated, gestures theatrical. Accuracy was negotiable, mood was essential. Even photography participated. Studio portraits featured Western women posed in kimono before painted backdrops of bamboo and fans. These images circulated as cabinet cards, souvenirs of cosmopolitan taste. The garment, once embedded in a structured social hierarchy, now floated freely in Western imagination. But something subtle shifted beneath the surface. As more Western women adopted kimono-inspired robes for private wear, designers began studying construction more seriously. The absence of curved seams intrigued them. Could clothing be cut more efficiently? Could silhouette be achieved without internal scaffolding? The kimono's geometry posed quiet questions, and questions, once asked, are difficult to silence. By the turn of the 20th century, reform in fashion was inevitable. The rigid hourglass of Victorian dress would gradually soften. Designers like Paul Poiret would reject the corset entirely, drawing inspiration from Eastern silhouettes, including the kimono. Later, couturiers would experiment with wide sleeves and straight lines that echoed Japanese forms. But in this late 19th century moment, the kimono remained largely symbolic in the West. It symbolized escape. It symbolized art. It symbolized a controlled kind of sensuality, one that could be adopted and removed at will. That distinction is important. In Japan, the kimono was daily life, shaped by ritual, class, and continuity. In the West, it became costume, chosen for mood, removed when necessary. The crush at this stage was tender but superficial. Admiration without full comprehension, desire without discipline. And yet, something enduring emerged from this encounter. European art changed permanently under the influence of Japanese composition. Interior design absorbed asymmetry. Fashion loosened, slowly but irreversibly. The fantasy may have been incomplete, but it was transformative. Infatuation reshaped industry. Still, beneath silk folds and aesthetic enthusiasm, the imbalance lingered. Western nations operated from positions of expanding imperial power. Japan navigated modernization under pressure. Cultural admiration existed within political tension. The kimono, draped across Western shoulders, carried none of that visible weight. But history always carries its context, whether acknowledged or not. Imagine again that London studio. The robe slips from a shoulder. Candlelight catches embroidered cranes mid-flight. Outside, factories hum, empires expand. Telegraph wires stretch across continents. Inside, silk whispers against skin. The fantasy feels real, but it is only one layer. And layers, as we will see, can conceal as much as they reveal. The crush was no longer new, it was dressed. And in dressing the fantasy, the West began rewriting the garment's story, whether it realized it or not.
Chapter 4: Art, Eroticism, and the Orient. Obsession rarely stays innocent. It begins with admiration. It matures into desire. And somewhere in between, it becomes projection. By the late 19th century, Japan was no longer simply admired in Europe. It was imagined, reconstructed, filtered through a Western lens already primed to romanticize what it labeled the Orient. The word itself carried weight. In European discourse, the Orient was less a geographic location and more a fantasy space, a realm of softness, sensuality, mystery, and emotional excess. It existed in contrast to the West, which saw itself as rational, industrial, disciplined. This dichotomy was convenient. It reinforced identity. And into this imaginative territory, Japan stepped, draped in silk. When Japanese woodblock prints, ukiyo-e, began circulating widely in Europe, they disrupted more than artistic composition. They introduced a new visual language of intimacy. Ukiyo-e, meaning pictures of the floating world, depicted actors, courtesans, city life, landscapes, and at times erotic scenes known as shunga. These works were not fringe or underground. In Edo-period Japan, they were part of a thriving print culture, affordable, reproducible, widely consumed. Eroticism in these prints was stylized, bodies elongated, expressions exaggerated, fabrics detailed with obsessive care. The kimono often framed the scene, partially loosened, sleeves cascading, collars slipping. Clothing was not removed dramatically, it was parted. Western collectors encountered these images with fascination and confusion. In Victorian Europe, sexuality was bound tightly by public morality. Nudity in academic painting existed within mythological frameworks, Venus, nymphs, allegories. Erotic material circulated certainly, but often discreetly. Japanese prints felt different. They were unapologetic. They depicted pleasure without the heavy moral scaffolding of classical narrative. The kimono present in these scenes became inseparable from the aura of sensuality Western viewers perceived. Silk was no longer simply aesthetic, it was erotic. But here, misunderstanding deepened. In Japan, erotic art had long existed within literary and artistic traditions that balanced humor, exaggeration, and social commentary. Shunga was not solely about titillation. It was about storytelling, relationships, even satire. Western audiences, however, often stripped away that context. They saw exoticism. They saw permission. They saw difference magnified into fantasy. Artists absorbed this imagery selectively. The flattened planes, the cropped compositions, the bold outlines influenced painters like Edgar Degas and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec, who explored intimate interiors and candid moments. But the kimono's presence in Western art increasingly carried a subtle charge. In studio paintings across Paris and London, women in kimono reclined on divans, gazed into mirrors, adjusted their hair. These were not Japanese women depicted within Japanese environments. They were Western models draped in imported robes. The garment transformed them. Or at least, it suggested transformation. The kimono allowed Western artists to imply sensuality without fully transgressing social norms. It created an aura of foreignness that made intimacy feel distant, less morally threatening. Desire, displaced onto the exotic, felt safer. This was the paradox of Orientalism. It both elevated and objectified. The East was admired for refinement, but also framed as emotionally indulgent, feminized, aesthetic rather than industrial, sensual rather than rational. The kimono, flowing and unstructured compared to corseted European dress, reinforced that narrative. Loose fabric suggested loosened morals, at least in Western imagination. And yet, in Japan, the kimono's structure was anything but loose. It required discipline. The obi had to be tied correctly, layers arranged precisely, movement controlled to maintain modesty. The erotic charge Western viewers perceived often arose not from exposure, but from suggestion, the glimpse of a collarbone, the reveal of the nape of the neck. In Japanese aesthetics, the nape was deeply sensual. Hair arranged high exposed a sliver of skin at the back, an area considered alluring precisely because it was partially concealed. Western painters began emphasizing this detail. Collars slipped lower in portraits, hair pinned up to reveal skin. The kimono framed the body differently than European dress, and artists exploited that framing. Consider the atmosphere of a Parisian atelier in the late 1880s. A model stands beneath filtered daylight. She wears a silk robe embroidered with cranes. The painter adjusts the collar slightly, lowering it to reveal more neck. He is not documenting Japan. He is staging mood. Meanwhile, literature amplified these impressions. Novels and travelogues described Japanese women as delicate, compliant, aesthetically perfect. These portrayals rarely captured the complexity of Meiji-era modernization, the political shifts, the social tensions unfolding in Japan. Instead, they reinforced fantasy. Opera followed suit. In 1904, Giacomo Puccini premiered Madama Butterfly, a tragic tale of a young Japanese woman abandoned by an American naval officer. The opera cemented an image of Japan in Western consciousness. Beautiful, tragic, emotionally intense. Costuming played a central role. Silk robes under stage lights shimmered with pathos. The kimono became shorthand for vulnerability and sacrifice. Audiences wept. But the narrative reinforced imbalance, East as devoted and fragile, West as powerful and transient. Art does not exist in isolation from politics. The late 19th century was also an age of imperial expansion. European powers carved territories across Asia and Africa. Even as Japan maintained sovereignty and rapidly modernized, it was still positioned within Western discourse as aesthetic rather than authoritative. The kimono's sensualization fed into that positioning. It softened Japan's image, made it consumable. And yet there was another layer. Not all Western engagement was superficial. Some artists and scholars sought deeper understanding. They studied Japanese techniques seriously. They learned about composition, negative space, the philosophy embedded in seasonal motifs. But popular culture moved faster than scholarship. Fashion magazines featured oriental robes. Department stores sold imitation kimonos trimmed with lace. Patterns once tied to specific symbolism, cranes for longevity, pine for resilience, became decorative motifs divorced from meaning. Silk turned into surface, and surface, repeated often enough, becomes stereotype. The erotization of the kimono also intersected with changing attitudes toward women's bodies in Europe. The fin de siècle period, the end of the 19th century, was marked by anxiety and experimentation. The new woman emerged, educated, independent, bicycling through city streets, questioning marriage and domestic roles. Looser garments aligned with this shift. The kimono-inspired robe suggested freedom from corsetry, freedom from rigid posture. It hinted at self-possession. But again, this freedom was curated. Most Western women who adopted such garments did so within private spaces. Public life still demanded conformity.
The kimono became a liminal object, existing between liberation and fantasy. It allowed experimentation without complete social rupture. Imagine a woman in 1895 standing before a mirror. She removes her corset at the end of the day. She slips into a silk robe imported from Yokohama. The fabric, cool against her skin, feels different, less constricting. For a moment, she imagines a life less bound. That feeling was real, even if its source was filtered through misunderstanding. The crush, by now, had deepened into desire, aesthetic, sensual, psychological. But desire built on projection cannot remain stable forever, because projection flattens complexity. Japan was not a floating dreamscape of silk and submission. It was a nation industrializing at astonishing speed. Railways expanded, factories rose, military power strengthened. Within decades, Japan would defeat Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, shocking Western observers and altering global perceptions. The feminized East proved formidable. But in Western art and popular imagination, the kimono retained its sensual aura. It became symbol rather than system, decoration rather than discipline. And yet, beneath the layers of projection, the garment endured. Silk threads did not unravel because they were misunderstood. They adapted, they traveled, they transformed. Obsession may distort, but it also reveals. The West's eroticization of the kimono
exposed its own anxieties about sexuality, about industrial modernity, about gender roles shifting beneath iron frameworks. The garment became a mirror, not of Japan alone, but of Europe's longing for softness in an age of steel. And as we move forward, that longing will reshape fashion itself, pulling inspiration from fantasy into structural change. Because once art and desire intertwine, they rarely remain confined to canvas. They step into the wardrobe, and from there, into history.
Chapter 5. The kimono enters haute couture. Infatuation can remain decorative, or it can become structural. By the turn of the 20th century, the West's fascination with the kimono had moved beyond studio walls and private dressing rooms. It no longer existed only as costume, fantasy, or aesthetic experiment. It began to reshape fashion itself. The late 19th century had been defined by engineering, bustles, boning, crinolines, rigid bodices that molded the female form into exaggerated proportions. But as the 20th century approached, the silhouette softened. Urban life accelerated. Women began working outside the home in greater numbers. The bicycle, the typewriter, the department store, all required mobility. Corsetry, once considered essential, started to feel impractical. Designers searched for alternatives, and some of them looked east. The kimono's construction, its radical simplicity, offered a blueprint. It was cut from rectangles. It required no curved seams to create shape. It wrapped rather than sculpted. It suggested that elegance could emerge from drape instead of compression. To Western couturiers accustomed to tailoring fabric around the body's contours, this logic was revolutionary. Among the earliest and most influential designers to absorb these ideas was Paul Poiret. In the early 1900s, Poiret declared war on the corset. He did not dismantle it quietly. He rejected it outright. Poiret admired Eastern dress, not only Japanese kimono, but also Ottoman and Persian garments. He studied the fluidity of robes, the absence of rigid internal structure. He saw possibility in looseness. In 1906, he introduced designs that eliminated the corset from his collections. High-waisted gowns flowed from the shoulders, sleeves widened, fabric fell in straight lines rather than cinched curves. Though his garments were not literal kimonos, the influence was unmistakable. He embraced drape. He embraced the idea that clothing could hang from the body rather than bind it. In doing so, he shifted the axis of fashion. For centuries, Western dress had shaped women into idealized forms through force, steel, whalebone, lacing. Now, a new silhouette emerged, inspired in part by garments that had never relied on such scaffolding. The kimono had crossed from fantasy into construction, and it would not be the last time. As the 20th century progressed, designers continued studying Japanese textiles and form. The straight seams of the kimono influenced pattern-making techniques. The wide sleeve, once viewed as exotic, became architectural inspiration. But this influence unfolded within a complicated global moment.
Japan, during the Meiji era and into the early 20th century, was rapidly industrializing. Western-style suits became standard for government officials. Military uniforms mirrored European models. Urban professionals increasingly adopted Western dress in daily life. The kimono did not disappear, but it shifted. It became ceremonial, formal, traditional. The garment that Europe saw as avant-garde simplicity was, in Japan, becoming a marker of cultural continuity amid modernization.
This irony lingered beneath the couture ateliers of Paris. In 1911, when Poiret staged lavish-themed parties celebrating Oriental aesthetics, guests wore turbans and flowing robes inspired by multiple Asian traditions. These events blurred geography into spectacle. Japan, Persia, and the Ottoman Empire blended into a single aesthetic mood. Cultural specificity softened under decorative enthusiasm. And yet, even within this blur, technical admiration persisted. The kimono's modular construction fascinated designers who sought efficiency. Unlike Western tailored garments, which required complex cutting to contour fabric, the kimono relied on geometry. Its panels were straight, its seams deliberate. Nothing was wasted. This economy of fabric resonated in an era increasingly aware of industrial scale. By the 1920s, the silhouette had shifted dramatically. The flapper dress of the Jazz Age hung loosely from the shoulders, minimizing curves rather than exaggerating them. While this shift resulted from multiple influences, changing gender roles, youth culture, wartime necessity, the groundwork had been laid by earlier designers who challenged corsetry. The idea that the body did not need to be reshaped to be fashionable had entered mainstream consciousness. And beneath that idea, faint but persistent, lay the memory of silk robes that flowed rather than constricted. The dialogue deepened mid-century. Designers such as Cristobal Balenciaga admired the kimono's volume and restraint. Balenciaga's later designs in the 1950s and 1960s featured wide sleeves, sculptural silhouettes, and garments that stood away from the body, creating space rather than clinging to form. Balenciaga studied global costume history with seriousness. His interest in Japanese form was not theatrical but structural. He saw in the kimono an alternative logic of shape. Similarly, Yves Saint Laurent would later explore kimono-inspired jackets and gowns, integrating wide sleeves and wrap constructions into modern collections. Saint Laurent's work often celebrated cross-cultural inspiration, though it too operated within Western fashion systems. By this point, the kimono's legacy was embedded rather than overt. It had moved from costume to code. But influence did not flow in only one direction. The 20th century also saw Japanese designers rise within global fashion. After World War II, Japan rebuilt its industries and entered international markets with renewed strength. By the 1980s, designers like Yohji Yamamoto and Rei Kawakubo challenged Western fashion capitals directly. Their designs disrupted silhouette again: asymmetry, deconstruction, monochrome palettes that emphasized shape over ornament. Though not traditional kimono, their work carried echoes of Japanese aesthetic philosophy: space, restraint, imperfection. When Yamamoto debuted in Paris in 1981, critics were divided. Some praised the radical departure from Western glamour. Others dismissed it as Hiroshima chic, a phrase revealing how easily aesthetic innovation becomes entangled with political prejudice. The conversation had evolved. Japan was no longer merely decorative inspiration. It was a creative force within haute couture. The kimono's legacy had come full circle. But let us return to the atelier in early 20th century Paris. Imagine fabric laid across a large cutting table, silk imported from Lyon, pattern pieces pinned carefully. A designer studies the fall of cloth over a mannequin. What if, he wonders, we let the fabric speak? What if we stop forcing it into curvature? The kimono had suggested that possibility decades earlier, even when misunderstood, even when romanticized. Fashion is often portrayed as frivolous, a surface art concerned only with trends. But clothing shapes how bodies move through space. It shapes posture. It shapes social interaction. When the corset loosened, breathing changed. When sleeves widened, gestures expanded. When garments hung from shoulders instead of gripping waists, the body experienced gravity differently. These shifts were not solely due to Japanese influence. History is never so singular. But the kimono's presence in Western imagination offered proof that another system of beauty already existed. A system without steel, a system without internal cages, a system rooted in drape. And so, haute couture absorbed what it once exoticized. The crush matured into respect, though imperfect and uneven. The kimono entered haute couture history not as trend, but as quiet revolution. Yet even here, tension remained. Western designers drew inspiration freely. Japanese artisans, meanwhile, continued preserving dyeing techniques, yuzen painting, shibori resist, intricate embroidery, within cultural frameworks shaped by centuries of etiquette. The haute couture gown, inspired by a kimono sleeve, was applauded on runways. The kimono itself, increasingly reserved for ceremonies in Japan, became emblem of heritage. One garment traveled through reinvention, the other stayed anchored to ritual. Both survived. Silk adapted. That is its nature. It bends without breaking. By the mid-20th century, the kimono was no longer novelty in the West. It was reference. Its silhouette had been translated, abstracted, woven into the language of modern design. The crush had shifted from surface to structure.
Chapter 6: War and Suspicion. There is a moment in every love affair when the illusion fractures, when fascination becomes discomfort, when admiration turns to distance, when the thing once adored begins to feel dangerous. By the early 20th century, the West's long infatuation with Japan had matured into something more complicated. The kimono was no longer merely an exotic curiosity draped over salon hostesses in Paris. It had entered fashion vocabulary. It had altered silhouettes. It had inspired couture. It had softened the rigid geometry of 19th century dress. But history does not move in straight lines, and neither does desire. The same nation, once romanticized as timeless and delicate, was transforming, industrializing, modernizing, militarizing. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 had already reshaped Japan's political structure, dissolving the Tokugawa shogunate and restoring imperial rule. Railways spread, factories rose, Western military techniques were studied and adopted. A constitutional monarchy formed. Japan was no longer an imagined pastoral fantasy. It was a modern power, and modern powers compete. In 1895, Japan defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War. In 1905, it stunned the world by defeating Imperial Russia, a European empire, in the Russo-Japanese War. The victory reverberated globally. For the first time in modern history, an Asian nation had defeated a major European military force. The West's perception shifted. Admiration mixed with unease. Japan was no longer merely aesthetic, it was formidable. By the 1920s and 30s, political tensions deepened. Japan expanded its influence into Korea and parts of China. Nationalism intensified. Military leadership gained power. The world economy staggered under the weight of the Great Depression. And slowly, the air thickened. In Europe and America, Japanese art still hung on walls. Kimono-inspired robes still drifted through boudoirs. Designers still referenced Eastern silhouettes. But beneath the silk, something harder was forming. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, international condemnation followed. When war with China escalated in 1937, headlines hardened. The idea of Japan in Western consciousness began to change. The kimono, once a symbol of refined, exotic beauty, now carried faint political shadow. And then came December 7th, 1941. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not merely a military strike. It was a psychological rupture. Overnight, fascination collapsed into fury. Governments mobilized. Propaganda machines roared to life. Lines were drawn with brutal clarity. In the United States, fear took physical form. Executive Order 9066 authorized the forced relocation and incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, the majority of whom were U.S. citizens. Families were uprooted, businesses abandoned, homes left behind. People were sent to internment camps surrounded by barbed wire. Silk did not protect anyone. The kimono in this atmosphere was no longer romantic. It was suspicious. It was foreign. It was a marker of otherness at a time when otherness could cost everything. Japanese cultural objects, prints, screens, garments, were no longer neutral decor. For some, they became reminders of an enemy. For others, they were quietly boxed away. Fashion, always sensitive to politics, adjusted. Designers distanced themselves from overt Japanese references. The soft lines inspired by kimono sleeves remained in circulation, but the word itself receded. Exoticism became less marketable when associated with wartime adversaries. In Europe, the situation carried its own complexities. Nations were consumed by conflict. Paris, the capital of couture, fell under Nazi occupation. Luxury contracted. Fabric was rationed. Design houses struggled to survive. The kimono silhouette, once associated with abundance and leisure, clashed with the austerity of wartime necessity. Clothing narrowed again. Utility replaced indulgence. Meanwhile, in Japan, war reshaped daily life with devastating intensity. Resources were redirected toward military production. Silk, once destined for ceremonial garments, was requisitioned for parachutes. Civilian clothing simplified. Bright dyes grew scarce. Patterns muted. The kimono did not disappear, but it adapted. Then came 1945. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Cities reduced to ash in seconds. The war ended not with elegance, but with annihilation. Japan lay physically and psychologically altered. The American occupation that followed introduced sweeping reforms, a new constitution, demilitarization, economic restructuring, cultural exchange under supervision. And here, something complicated occurred. In the years after the war, American servicemen stationed in Japan encountered kimono once more, not as enemy artifact, but as souvenir. Silk robes were purchased and brought home. Department stores in the United States began selling Japanese-style dressing gowns again. But the tone had changed. Pre-war fascination had been dreamy. Post-war consumption was transactional. The kimono became a commodity in a rebuilding economy eager for exports. It entered global markets stripped in many cases of ritual context. It was shortened, resized, repackaged for Western consumers. Meanwhile, within Japan, modernization accelerated. Western-style clothing became everyday attire, particularly in urban areas. The kimono shifted increasingly toward formal occasions, weddings, coming-of-age ceremonies, funerals. It moved from daily life into tradition. War had accelerated this transition. And yet, beneath suspicion, beneath trauma, admiration never entirely vanished. Artists who had once studied Japanese woodblock prints did not suddenly forget what they had learned. Designers who had internalized kimono construction did not erase those influences from their craft. The exchange, though strained, had already left permanent marks. But suspicion lingers longer than silk.
During the Cold War, Japan's identity in Western consciousness remained layered: ally, economic competitor, cultural enigma. The kimono persisted as a symbol, sometimes romantic, sometimes nostalgic, sometimes commercial, rarely neutral. Because objects do not escape the histories wrapped around them. A garment that once represented aesthetic liberation in Paris had, within a generation, become entangled in global conflict. It had been worn in paintings of languid fantasy and boxed away during wartime fear. It had been confiscated, sold, adapted, misunderstood. It had survived. And survival in itself is a kind of quiet power. By the mid-20th century, the world was reshaping itself again. Global trade resumed. Cultural exchange expanded under new frameworks. Designers would once more look east, though now with more awareness and sometimes with more caution. But the innocence of the first crush was gone. War had exposed the cost of projection. It had demonstrated how quickly admiration can harden into hostility when politics intervene. Silk is soft. History is not. As we move forward, the kimono will reemerge in new contexts, in avant-garde fashion, in global runways, in conversations about cultural appropriation and identity. It will be celebrated, contested, reclaimed. But it will never again exist in a vacuum, because after war, nothing does. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson beneath this chapter. The kimono was never merely a garment. It was a mirror reflecting how nations see one another, how desire can become distortion, how beauty can coexist with power, how admiration can survive even after devastation. In times of peace, we romanticize. In times of war, we categorize. And in the aftermath, we reckon. The silk remains, but the story woven into it is heavier now. In the next chapter, we will explore how the kimono returns to global fashion, not as naive fantasy, not as wartime suspicion, but as something sharper, more self-aware, and deeply entangled in questions of identity and ownership. Because the crush did not end. It evolved. And evolution, like history, leaves seams you can trace if you know where to look. Chapter 7. Post-war pop culture. After the war, the world did not simply rebuild, it reimagined itself. Cities rose from rubble, economies restructured, alliances shifted, technology accelerated. Television flickered into living rooms, Hollywood expanded its reach, music crossed oceans faster than ships ever could. And somewhere within this new global current, the kimono returned, not as relic, not as enemy, but as image. The post-war decades, particularly the 1950s and 1960s, were defined by spectacle. Cinema widened its screens, color saturated film, glamour became exportable. And Japan, now under American occupation until 1952, and then rapidly rebuilding as a modern industrial power, entered global consciousness in a new way. This time through pop culture. Hollywood rediscovered Japan almost immediately, but through its own lens. Films set in Tokyo or Kyoto framed the country as visually stunning, emotionally restrained, culturally intricate. The kimono appeared on screen once more, luminous beneath studio lights. But now it functioned differently. In the late 19th century, the kimono had signaled mystery and sensual escape. In the immediate post-war era, it often signaled contrast, East versus West, tradition versus modernity, softness versus steel. Actresses moved through carefully constructed Japanese interiors. Shoji screens glowed, paper lanterns swayed, silk sleeves trailed like brushstrokes. The camera lingered. The West still loved the silhouette, but it was no longer naive. It was stylized. At the same time, Japan's own film industry was entering what many historians now call its golden age. Directors like Akira Kurosawa, Yasujiro Ozu, and Kenji Mitsugishi crafted works that traveled internationally and reshaped global cinema. In films such as Rashomon and Seven Samurai, historical costume, including kimono, was not decorative fantasy, it was narrative architecture. Fabric conveyed class, sleeve length indicated marital status, pattern hinted at personality. Western audiences, many encountering Japanese storytelling for the first time beyond wartime propaganda, were exposed to something more layered than the exotic Orient of earlier decades. Yet even as cinematic appreciation deepened, pop culture simplified. In the 1960s and 1970s, global youth movements embraced the East as shorthand for spiritual escape. Meditation, martial arts, Zen aesthetics, and Eastern philosophies entered Western counterculture. The kimono, with its loose structure and flowing lines, became a favored garment among artists, musicians, and bohemians. It was comfortable, it was unstructured, it felt anti-establishment. Rock musicians wore silk robes on stage, designers adapted kimono sleeves into flowing jackets, psychedelic prints mingled with traditional motifs. The garment that once symbolized aristocratic etiquette now signaled rebellion in certain circles. Irony upon irony. The kimono, historically precise, seasonally coded, etiquette-bound, was being worn as an emblem of freedom from rules. Meanwhile, in Japan, fashion was undergoing its own transformation. Western dress had become everyday norm in cities. Business suits, school uniforms, department store dresses. Modernity had a wardrobe. But the kimono did not vanish. It evolved into ceremony. weddings, coming-of-age celebrations, tea ceremonies, funerals. It became a marker of continuity in a rapidly modernizing society. And then, in the late 20th century, Japan's pop culture machine accelerated with astonishing force. Anime, manga, video games, television dramas. Global distribution channels expanded. By the 1980s and 1990s, characters wearing stylized kimono appeared not just in art house films, but in animated series watched by millions. Franchises such as Sailor Moon blended modern school uniforms with traditional imagery. Historical epics like Rurouni Kenshin revived Meiji-era silhouettes for global youth audiences. Later, series like Demon Slayer, Kimetsu no Yaiba would stylize kimono patterns into bold, graphic signatures instantly recognizable worldwide. Patterns once subtle and seasonally symbolic became high-contrast icons. Geometry replaced gradation. Silk translated into ink and pixel. For many young viewers outside Japan, their first encounter with kimono was animated, flattened, stylized, dynamic. The crush was no longer confined to elite salons or couture houses. It was global. It was digital. Cosplay communities emerged, recreating elaborate kimono-inspired costumes with painstaking detail. Conventions filled with handmade obi belts and meticulously folded collars. Social media accelerated visual exchange. Aesthetic appreciation traveled faster than historical explanation. At the same time, Japan's domestic fashion scene was pushing boundaries in the opposite direction. Designers like Rei Kawakubo of Comme des Garçons and Yoji Yamamoto entered Paris fashion weeks in the 1980s with silhouettes that shocked Western audiences. Black, asymmetry, deconstruction, garments that challenged conventional tailoring.
Though not literal kimono reproductions, their work carried structural philosophies rooted in Japanese dress traditions. Flat pattern construction, fabric as plain rather than sculpted volume, space between body and cloth. Western critics initially called it Hiroshima chic, revealing how quickly fashion commentary could slip into geopolitical reference. But over time, these designers transformed global fashion language. The kimono's influence had matured from surface decoration to structural thinking. And yet, pop culture continued to oscillate between reverence and caricature. Music videos used kimono as visual shorthand for exotic. Advertising campaigns draped models in silk without context. Halloween costumes reduced centuries of tradition to costume cliché. Simultaneously, Japanese street fashion movements, from Harajuku's layered eclecticism to Gothic Lolita subcultures, mixed kimono elements with Victorian lace, punk accessories, and neon plastic. Cultural exchange was no longer one-directional. It was collision. In the 1990s and early 2000s, as globalization intensified, conversations about cultural borrowing grew sharper. Was wearing a kimono appreciation, appropriation, fashion homage, commodity? Pop culture thrives on remixing. Tradition thrives on continuity. The tension between those impulses became increasingly visible. Yet through all reinterpretations, sincere, commercial, rebellious, or misguided, the kimono endured as symbol. Why? Because it remains visually unmistakable. The T-shaped silhouette, the wide sleeves, the obi tied in structured precision at the back. It carries history in outline alone. And pop culture, which depends on instantly legible imagery, understands the power of outline.
By the 21st century, the kimono existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions: traditional garment worn in Kyoto ceremonies, high fashion reference on Paris runways, anime costume on convention floors, tourist souvenir, heirloom passed between generations. It was no longer merely an object, it was a cultural interface. Post-war pop culture did not dilute the kimono's significance, it multiplied it. It turned a national garment into global visual vocabulary. But multiplication comes with distortion. Aesthetic love can flatten nuance. Familiarity can erase origin. Repetition can transform meaning. And yet, beneath reinterpretation, beneath commercialization, the original craft continues. In workshops across Japan, artisans still hand-dye silk using techniques centuries old. Obi are still woven on traditional looms. Kimono are still stitched from straight seams designed to be unpicked and remade. The garment remains structurally unchanged.
What has changed is the gaze. In the 19th century, the West gazed at Japan with romantic distance. In wartime, it gazed with suspicion. In post-war pop culture, it gazed with fascination amplified by media, multiplied, stylized, sometimes simplified. The crush has gone mainstream. And mainstream attention is powerful. It keeps images alive. It also reshapes them. As we move into the next chapter, we will confront the question that inevitably follows global visibility. Who owns a silhouette? Who has the right to wear it, reinterpret it, profit from it? Because in a world connected by screens and runways and streaming platforms, admiration is no longer private, it is public. And public admiration invites scrutiny. The kimono has survived seclusion. It has survived war. It has survived fashion cycles. Now it navigates something more abstract: global identity. And the story, as always, is still unfolding, one fold of silk at a time. Chapter 8. The Kimono Today. There is something extraordinary about a garment that survives its own myth. The kimono has been admired, exoticized, commercialized, politicized, misunderstood, reimagined, and yet it remains. Not frozen in a museum case, not preserved in amber, but alive. Today, the kimono occupies a paradoxical space. It is both everyday and ceremonial, both global symbol and deeply local practice, both contested and cherished. In modern Japan, most people no longer wear kimono as daily attire. Western-style clothing dominates offices, schools, city streets. Suits, denim, sneakers, fast fashion, these define the rhythm of contemporary life. And yet, on certain mornings, the streets transform. On coming-of-age day, young women step carefully from taxis in elaborately patterned firisote, their long sleeves swinging like pendulums of color. Obi are tied in sculptural bows that require professional hands. Hair is arranged with precision. Footsteps are measured in wooden geta or lacquered zori. At weddings, brides move beneath white shiramuku layered with symbolism centuries deep. At tea ceremonies, practitioners kneel in subdued tones of silk, their garments harmonizing with tatami mats and seasonal scrolls. The kimono has shifted from routine to ritual, from daily necessity to deliberate choice. And that choice carries weight. Wearing kimono today often requires knowledge: how to fold, how to layer, how to tie. It demands patience. It demands time.
In a world obsessed with speed, the kimono insists on slowness. There is quiet resistance in that. At the same time, a new generation is redefining what the garment can be. Independent designers across Japan are experimenting with bold fabrics, unconventional layering, unexpected pairings. Vintage kimono are deconstructed and reassembled. Antique obi become handbags. Traditional dye techniques are applied to modern silhouettes. The conversation is no longer about preservation alone. It is about adaptation.
Designers such as Jotaro Saito have pushed kimono into contemporary aesthetics, blending streetwear sensibilities with classical structure. Meanwhile, international designers continue to draw from kimono construction, sometimes overtly, sometimes subtly. But today, unlike in the 19th century, the exchange is not one-directional fantasy. It is dialogue. Social media has transformed visibility. A kimono artisan in Kyoto can share their process with a global audience in real time. A cultural debate in Tokyo can ripple through New York within hours. Visibility creates accountability, and accountability reshapes the crush. In recent years, public conversations about cultural appropriation have sharpened. Museums, fashion houses, and public institutions have faced scrutiny over how Japanese garments are displayed and worn. In 2015, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston faced criticism over a public program inviting visitors to try on a kimono replica associated with Claude Monet's painting of his wife in Japanese dress. What had once been framed as interactive appreciation was re-examined through the lens of power dynamics and historical context. The question was no longer, is it beautiful? The question became, who benefits? These conversations are not always comfortable, but discomfort can clarify. The kimono today is entangled in discussions of identity, diaspora, commerce, and respect. Japanese Americans whose families endured wartime incarceration navigate complex relationships with cultural visibility. Some embrace kimono as reclamation, others approach with caution. Meanwhile, global fashion brands occasionally release kimono-inspired pieces stripped of origin, marketed with vague Eastern language. Backlash follows. Statements are issued, lessons are learned. Sometimes. The crush has matured into negotiation. Yet amid debate, the craft continues. In Nishijin, Kyoto's historic weaving district, artisans still operate looms whose rhythms echo across centuries. In Arimatsu, shibori tie-dye masters knot silk with meticulous care before dipping it into indigo vats. In rural workshops, yuzen painters apply rice paste resist to outline patterns before brushing dye into silk by hand. These are not mass processes. They are intimate. They are time-bound. And time is the one element globalization cannot accelerate without consequence.
The economic reality is complex. Kimono production is labor-intensive and expensive. Fewer young people pursue traditional apprenticeships. Some workshops close. Others pivot, offering classes, collaborations, digital storefronts. Preservation now requires innovation. Interestingly, international fascination has sometimes helped sustain local craft. Tourists seek authentic pieces. Overseas collectors invest in antique kimono. Museums mount exhibitions that contextualize history with greater nuance than in previous eras. The gaze has not disappeared. It has evolved. In popular culture, the kimono continues to appear, but often with greater awareness. Films, anime, and fashion editorials increasingly consult cultural advisors. Designers collaborate directly with Japanese artisans. The narrative is shifting from extraction to partnership. Not perfectly, but perceptibly. There is also a quiet resurgence among young Japanese creatives, reclaiming kimono as everyday expression. Some wear vintage pieces with sneakers. Others pair obi with denim jackets. Instagram feeds showcase street-style kimono, layered in ways that would have startled Edo-period etiquette manuals. Tradition, after all, has never been static. Even during the Tokugawa era, patterns changed with political edicts. Colors signaled shifting class codes. Innovation occurred within constraint. Today's reinterpretations are simply the latest chapter in a long lineage of adaptation. And then there is sustainability. In an era increasingly conscious of environmental cost, the kimono's original construction philosophy feels unexpectedly modern. Straight seams allow for complete disassembly. Fabric can be reused. Garments can be resized, re-dyed, repurposed. Nothing is wasted. The garment that once symbolized the exotic East now offers practical lessons in circular design. History, it seems, loops.
But perhaps the most profound transformation lies in perception. The 19th century West projected fantasy onto the kimono. The wartime West projected fear. Post-war pop culture projected spectacle. Today, projection competes with presence. Voices from within Japan shape the narrative. Diasporic communities contribute perspective. Scholars unpack history with nuance. Designers articulate intention openly. The kimono is no longer silent object. It is active participant. And what does it mean in this moment to wear one? For some, it is continuity with ancestors. For others, it is aesthetic pleasure. For others still, it is political statement. A reminder that culture cannot be flattened into trend. The crush that began in silk-draped salons has matured into something more layered. Admiration tempered by awareness. Fascination balanced with respect. Does misunderstanding still occur? Yes. Does commercialization persist? Certainly. But conversation now travels alongside consumption. That, perhaps, is progress. The kimono today exists at the intersection of memory and movement. It carries centuries in its folds, yet it moves through airports, onto runways, across digital screens. It is photographed endlessly. And still, in quiet rooms in Kyoto, someone kneels on tatami and adjusts a collar with deliberate care. Left side over right, never reversed. Because some details matter deeply. The garment has survived isolation, industrialization, war, globalization. It has been loved imperfectly, and yet it endures with composure. Silk, when woven tightly, is remarkably strong. As we close this chapter, and soon this story, we return to the central truth that has followed us from the beginning. The kimono was never simply fabric. It was always relationship. Between body and cloth, between nation and outsider, between admiration and projection, between past and present. And like all relationships, it has required growth.
The crush remains, but it is no longer naive. It is informed. It asks questions. It listens. And in that listening, perhaps we finally approach something closer to understanding. The silk still flows, but now we notice the hands that weave it.
Chapter 9. What a Crush Reveals. There is something almost innocent about a crush. It begins with distance, with admiration from afar, with fascination that feels harmless, with the thrill of discovering something beautiful that does not belong to you. But a crush is never only about the one being admired. It is also about the admirer. And that is where this story truly settles. For nearly 2 centuries, the West has carried a crush on the kimono, on Japan through the lens of silk. It has projected longing, fear, desire, romance, spirituality, minimalism, sensuality, rebellion, and refinement onto a single garment. And in doing so, it has revealed far more about itself than about the cloth. Because a crush simplifies. It flattens complexity into image. It turns culture into aesthetic. It replaces lived experience with surface. When 19th century Europe first encountered Japanese art and dress after Commodore Matthew Perry forced open Japanese ports in 1853, what flooded into Paris and London was not simply merchandise, it was imagination. Artists like Claude Monet surrounded themselves with Japanese prints. James McNeill Whistler incorporated Asian motifs into his compositions. The movement we now call Japanism reshaped Western art. But Japanism was never Japan itself. It was interpretation, a translation filtered through longing. The kimono in this early phase symbolized escape from industrial Europe, from soot-choked cities and rigid social codes. It represented a world that seemed harmonious, nature-oriented, spiritually balanced. Whether that vision matched daily life in Edo or Meiji Japan was almost beside the point. The crush was not built on accuracy. It was built on desire. And desire edits. Later, when the kimono entered haute couture through designers like Paul Poiret, it signaled liberation from corsets and Victorian restraint. Western women draped themselves in silhouettes inspired by Japanese construction and called it freedom. Yet in Japan, the kimono was structured by strict etiquette, sleeves signifying marital status, colors dictated by season, motifs carrying coded meaning. Freedom in one context, formality in another. The crush saw only what it needed. During wartime, that same garment shifted from romantic to suspicious. Silk became a reminder of geopolitical threat. Japanese Americans were incarcerated. Cultural objects were boxed away. The crush, wounded, recoiled. After the war, pop culture revived the image, stylized, cinematic, consumable. Anime, fashion editorials, music videos turned the kimono into global visual shorthand. Again, the crush adapted. And now, in the present, the conversation has matured into critique. What does it mean to admire across difference? Where is the line between appreciation and appropriation? Who controls narrative? Who profits? Who speaks? These questions extend beyond the kimono. They sit at the center of globalization itself. because the kimono's journey reveals a broader truth. When cultures meet, power shapes perception. The West did not merely discover Japan in the 19th century. It encountered it through unequal treaties and naval intimidation. The opening of ports was not mutual curiosity. It was geopolitical pressure. That context matters. It complicates the romance. Similarly, the adoption of kimono silhouettes into Western fashion occurred within systems of colonial expansion and global trade imbalances. Admiration traveled alongside empire. That too matters. But here is where the story resists easy condemnation. Because exchange is not inherently theft. Art has always moved across borders. Influence is not a crime. Curiosity is not exploitation by default. The problem is not fascination. The problem is forgetting. Forgetting origin. Forgetting context. Forgetting the hands behind the object. A crush forgets. It sees the sleeve and not the seamstress, the silhouette and not the social code, the aesthetic and not the history. But when fascination deepens into relationship, something changes. You begin to ask questions. You begin to listen. In recent decades, scholars, designers, and cultural advocates have insisted on nuance. Japanese voices have articulated pride, frustration, gratitude, and concern in equal measure. Diasporic communities have complicated the narrative further, holding both pain and celebration. The kimono today sits within this dialogue, not as passive symbol, but as participant. It asks, what are you really seeing when you look at me? Are you seeing a costume, a trend, a relic, a craft tradition, a living culture? The answer says more about the observer than the garment. There is also something humbling in recognizing how long the crush has lasted. Nearly 200 years of Western fascination, reshaped across generations, technologies, ideologies. Few garments endured that kind of sustained projection. And yet, through all reinterpretations, the kimono has retained structural integrity. The T-shape remains. The straight seams persist. The leftover right fold continues as silent rule. It absorbs reinterpretation without dissolving. Perhaps that is the quiet power at the heart of this story. The kimono did not chase Western attention. It existed. The West arrived. The crush began. But Japan continued weaving, continued dyeing, continued dressing its own milestones in silk. What a crush reveals, ultimately, is asymmetry. The admirer feels transformed. The admired may simply carry on. There is also vulnerability in being admired. When something becomes symbol, it risks reduction. When something becomes trend, it risks dilution. When something becomes spectacle, it risks stereotype. And yet, to reject all admiration would mean retreating into isolation. The challenge, then, is balance between openness and protection, between sharing and safeguarding, between inspiration and integrity. In that sense, the kimono's journey mirrors the modern world's tension between global exchange and cultural specificity. We are all now entangled. Images travel instantly. Fashion circulates seasonally across continents. Ideas remix at digital speed. The crush is no longer contained within elite salons.
It is algorithmic. And so the responsibility grows to admire responsibly, to research before replicating, to collaborate rather than extract, to acknowledge lineage. Perhaps the most meaningful shift in recent years is this. The conversation includes those who wear kimono not as costume, but as inheritance. Young designers in Kyoto experimenting with contemporary patterns while honoring ancestral techniques. Japanese-American artists reclaiming kimono as intergenerational bridge. Scholars contextualizing Edo aesthetics within political and economic frameworks. The crush is no longer monologue, it is dialogue. And dialogue, unlike obsession, requires listening. If this story has revealed anything, it is that beauty is rarely simple. Silk is soft, but the systems that move silk across oceans are complex. Fashion is aesthetic, but it is also political. Admiration feels personal, but it often rests on historical scaffolding. The kimono's global journey exposes the layers beneath surface fascination. It shows how easily we romanticize what we do not fully understand. It shows how quickly admiration can turn to fear when power shifts. It shows how resilience allows tradition to endure projection. And it shows how growth is possible. The crush is no longer blind. It has been educated by war, by scholarship, by critique, by collaboration. It has matured. And perhaps that is the quiet resolution of this story. Not that the West stopped loving the kimono, but that love became more careful, more aware, less about possession, more about respect. There will always be fascination. There will always be reinterpretation. Fashion will continue borrowing. Artists will continue blending influences. The world will continue colliding beautifully and imperfectly. But now, when silk sleeves move across a runway in Paris or appear in a film streamed worldwide, there is at least the possibility that someone pauses and asks, where did this begin? Who shaped it first? What does it mean there, not just here? A crush reveals longing, but it also reveals capacity. Capacity to grow beyond fantasy, capacity to hold complexity, capacity to admire without erasing. The kimono remains, not as fantasy, not as relic, but as reminder that beauty deserves context, that admiration demands humility, and that when cultures meet, the most meaningful exchange is not imitation, it is understanding. The silk is still flowing, the seams are still straight. The story, like the garment, remains open, waiting for the next careful fold. There is a particular sound a vault makes when it closes. Not loud, not dramatic, but decisive. A low, resonant echo of something secured. Tonight, we began with silk, with a garment that drifted across oceans and unsettled expectations, with a crush, innocent at first glance, that unfolded into something far more complicated. We traced the stillness of a nation closed under the Tokugawa shogunate. We stood at the moment when Commodore Matthew Perry's ships appeared on the horizon, forcing Japan's ports open and altering the course of cultural exchange.
We watched as Europe fell under the spell of Japonisme, as artists like Claude Monet reframed their canvases, and designers like Paul Poiret reimagined the female silhouette. We followed the kimono through war, through suspicion, through pop culture spectacle, through global reinvention. And at every turn, the fabric remained, absorbing projection, surviving distortion, enduring fascination. A crush can begin with beauty, but it reveals itself through time. What began as admiration became fantasy. What became fantasy turned into fashion. What fashion carried was politics. What politics ignited was fear. And what survived was dialogue. Silk and steel, obsession and reckoning. A garment that never asked to be a symbol, yet became one. And perhaps that is the final truth tucked inside this story. The kimono was never chasing the world's gaze. It was worn in tea rooms and temples, in weddings and quiet family ceremonies, in daily life long before Paris noticed its sleeves. It carried season and status, craftsmanship and care. The world arrived, the world projected, the world loved, and sometimes misunderstood. But through it all, the hands that wove, dyed, stitched, and folded continued their work. There is humility in that. In a time when trends flare and vanish within months, the kimono moves differently. It does not rush. It does not shout. It does not contort itself to match every passing aesthetic wave. It endures, and endurance is its own quiet form of strength. What a crush ultimately revealed was not just Western longing, but the complexity of cultural exchange itself. The way admiration can blur into appropriation, the way beauty can be politicized, the way misunderstanding can coexist with genuine reverence. But it also revealed something hopeful, that fascination can evolve, that projection can give way to partnership, that awareness can follow error. The crush did not disappear. It matured.
And maturity, like well-woven silk, holds tension without tearing. As we close this chapter, as we turn the key and lower the heavy door of the vault, consider what stories lie hidden in the objects around you. What garments carry histories you've never asked about? What designs traveled farther than you realized? What beauty have you admired without tracing its origin? Every culture leaves fingerprints in fabric. Every era leaves seams. The kimono taught us that. It taught us that even something as seemingly simple as a robe can contain centuries of diplomacy, conflict, artistry, and identity. That admiration is powerful, but responsibility is more powerful still. And now, as the echoes settle, as silk folds carefully back into darkness, we do what we always do here. We lock the vault. Not to hide the truth, but to preserve it. If you found yourself looking differently at the next garment you see, if this story shifted the way you think about beauty, history, and the quiet politics stitched into fashion, then make sure you like and subscribe for more stories from the Story Vault, Buried Truths. Because there are always more doors to open,
more myths to unravel, more histories waiting beneath the surface. And remember, history isn't just written in books. Sometimes it's hanging in your closet, judging your ironing skills. We'll see you next time.